Now we can go on with the presentation, and in this sequence we will see some methods and elements to establish a diagnosis. This is the first step of an adaptation process, and at this stage you will have done some preliminary works, for example, to identify existing strategies in the territory, to understand the motivation of the adaptation process, to define the team, mobilize the team, the pilot of this adaptation process. And it's also at this stage you begin a reflection about the data to consider in this process. An important point we would like to share again is the notion of the vision. Why your local authority, your organization engage this process. For us, it's not only a question of a rule or a legal obligation. For example, some economic aspects or the aim to be the safest city in the world as Los Angeles illustrate this politic vision of adaptation. So to establish the diagnosis, also called vulnerability assessment, we need to consider three components. The combination of the hazard, the exposure sensitivity, and the adaptive capacity determine a level of vulnerability. With the diagnosis, you can understand the main stakes now in the future for your territory. In more detail, the hazard will refer to climatic parameters and induced phenomena such as drought or flooding by runoff. We'll talk about physical data. Hazard can refer to extreme parameters such as intense rainfall or climatic trend hazard such as the decrease in frost frequency. The use of the cartography is a way to represent the hazard data. In this illustration, Institut Paris Région, for the needs of a territorial diagnosis, represent the number of the heat wave days at different time horizons and according to the scenario considered. We can see the trend and the amplitude of the number of heat wave days. Here you have the observation in the past, and you can see the range between 6 and 10 days of heat wave. And if we are in the worst scenario, you can see the trend and the amplitude of this number regarding the time horizon. And so you can see that we can reach 30 days of heat waves, and moreover in long term. The question is to understand how the hazard affect the territory and the level of sensitivity. For example, when we talk about heat waves, we can imagine that an urban territory will be particularly affected capturing this heat. Health impacts are expected, especially for part of the population, the youngest and the eldest, but not only. The sensitivity of a territory will be more or less high regarding this proportion. Other factors need to be considered in order to understand how the people, the territory cope with the risk. For example, regarding the level of income the health care offer, and so on. To analyze the exposure and sensitivity, we need multiple socio-economic data, and we have to cross this data to understand this sensitivity of the territory. Some information characterize the level of sensitivity of the territory. This slide sums up several questions helping to organize this information. For example, what facilities have been damaged, destroyed by the climate hazard? Did the climate hazard create economic losses? And other examples. Maybe you may need to collect information and conduct surveys asking stakeholders territory to collect this information and to help you to establish this diagnosis. We can use also cartographic tool to represent this sensitivity. In this case, this cartography established by Institut Paris Région represent the flood impacts of the Seine River in the city of Gennevilliers near Paris. In blue, you can see infrastructure and buildings directly concerned by the flood. But we can see also in red fragile area of energy networks, which concern the area not directly concerned by the flood, but they expect some impacts regarding dysfunctionment of, for example, transport from energy and so on. So we can see a large area concerned by the flood, not only the area directly indirectly damaged by the water. The third component will concern the adaptive capacity. The aim is to identify some policies, measures, financial means available, which could moderate the climate impacts. So the articulation of the three components will help you to determine the level of vulnerability. The challenge is to collect a large range of data. Furthermore, you will need some projection in order to analyze the future vulnerabilities. The level of vulnerability is not an absolute value. You need to involve all stakeholders for a shared vision of the issues. Not of all will have the same perceptions. In most cases, the diagnosis can be established by using different classes of ponderation. For example, high, low, medium. And we can see an example with the city of Belgrade. In the beginning, you have to consider a referential matrix in order to classify your results. And this is the example of the city of Belgrade, and they decline this matrix from the term of population and infrastructure, and they can establish for each component what are the level of their sensitivity and vulnerability regarding different parametric climate parameters. One of the difficulty is to cross several data in order to get this vision of vulnerability. In this slide, you have a view of some data used to establish this diagnosis. For the need of the learning course, we have established a benchmark of the most common indicator used for each component. You can visualize some extract of these works. So, for example, for data, for hazard, you have data about the number of summon days, of heat wave days. For exposure, you can interest about the share of the population age over 65, about the disruption of public services, number of the day, monitoring of phenology flooring dates, and so on. And for adaptive capacity, you can, for example, collect information about the greening rate of the cities. If we have a synthetic view of indicators, it's necessary to understand in which way we can obtain the data. Some of them are available inside your own organization, but others need to be collected from variety of actors, for example, observatories, forest and nature agency, water agencies, health observatory, insurance field, and maybe you have to search alternative solutions if you don't get this information on your territory. For example, find data from a higher territorial scale, observatory, and on national or European scale. And that's why we suggest you also to refer to a climate adapt. It's important also to rely on about the knowledge, the feedback of the actors of your territory.
So there was a question from the participants about basically some resources with examples of indicators that can be used for different measures. So I know this was kind of what you were talking about. So maybe the things that you would recommend is especially the Climate Adapt platform, where there's a lot of information available. I don't know if you would like to, maybe just complete on that, on where you can find resources to help define different indicators on different sectors, etc.
Yes, in fact, the difficulty it's about the collect of the data, and maybe you can they are not available at the level of your territory, and most of the time we suggest to refer to the higher scale of territory. And for example, in Europe, we have the opportunity to get information with climate adapt. But you can also have some information with IPCC. It's true that it's a macro level, but it can give you some trend about the parameter climate, for example, or they can give you some information about economic and social elements for your territory. It's difficult because we say that adaptation is a question of a local scale, but it's not always easy to get information about at this level. Another maybe advice is to create a community with the stakeholders in order to exchange also the information they have regarding their activities, regarding their missions. And that's why it's important at the beginning on the process of adaptation to create this community, to create the vision of adaptation and to understand what kind of information and data you can exchange each other in order to establish this vision of vulnerability of the territory. It's very complex, but maybe with the support of these stakeholders, you can go on with the diagnosis. Maybe I think the most important is to have a view of the main stakes, even if you don't have the detail of the data. The most important is to start to have a view of the main stakes, to understand the interdependencies, also to have this global vision and to start the work of adaptation. And more and more you will create also this data when you go on with this adaptation process. And another point I said before, it's the knowledge, the local knowledge. Maybe you have to conduct some surveys with the inhabitants, with the stakeholders, in order to have their feedbacks and the some elements and some data to help you for this diagnosis. I don't know if I answer your question, but I think it's the advice I will suggest. Maybe there is another question in the conversation section. I don't see. Sorry. No, it's okay. We have another.
I don't know if you necessarily have. I know this is something that we already discussed before.
Okay.
Which is a debate basically about the how to say, like how to argument the budget, the financial means that you will put to adaptation measures, and basically how to argue for the benefits of putting money into adaptation measures, comparing to the measures that the budget that we will dedicate, for example, to mitigation. So maybe this whole aspect of how to justify the budget that you're spending for adaptation measures at the scale of a local authority.
Yes, I think we will see this point in when we will talk about strategy and action plan. But I think the difficulty is not to oppose mitigation and adaptation, and this is what happened at the beginning of the international negotiations with the different how was I say, for example, yes, sorry. Yes, before when they start to cope with the climate change, there is this idea to put all the efforts for the mitigation, because we will have time to see the effect and the subject of adaptation. But in fact, they understand that we have to consider this global vision of the climate change mitigation and adaptation. And maybe one answer is to consider action that they could have co-benefits, adaptation and mitigation, or action that are not maladaptation, as say Francisca, will not damage the action of mitigation, for example. I think we have to consider the same. We have to consider the same objective, the same efforts to mitigation and adaptation. We need to to attribute the same ambitious in the financial means in the two subjects if we want to succeed to cope with the climate change. Now, for the adaptation, we have to justify maybe more than mitigation, some action, but now we understand that cost and damages could be an argument to justify the adaptation strategy and the adaptation action. But we will see this point later during the presentation.